anybody here with any Irish in them? Is there any of the girls that like a little more Irish in them? Don't believe me if I tell you not a word of this is true.
Thin Lizzy were the ultimate boys' own rock band. Some say the best ever to come out of Ireland.
Don't believe me if I tell you.
Great song, great guitar playing. Every modern rock band has a little bit of Thin Lizzy in them.
They inspired average people to think, well, if you can do it, so can I.
Don't believe a word. Words you almost spoke.
Throughout the 70s, they produced hit after hit, their distinctive vocals and twin guitars lending a whole new sound to hard rock. At their heart was lead singer Philip Lynott, writer of some of rock's greatest anthems.
He brought a vivid intelligence to this thing that could be just dismissed as adolescent boys' music.
The shapes, the look, the style, you know, the pointing. He had the crowd in the palm of his hand.
But with these talents and the success that followed came legendary rock and roll behavior.
I did get into a lot of fights.
It was the roller coaster ride, you know. Is it going to stay on track or is it going to fly off the rails?
There was always kind of shit happening, if you like.
The least professional band in the business.
This is the story of a band that from small beginnings went on to conquer the world through raw talent, hard work, and a little bit of Irish luck. It's early 2010, and on a Tuesday morning at Dublin Airport, one man stands out among the hordes of tourists and business travellers. Almost 30 years after Ireland's first rock supergroup split, Thin Lizzy's ex-guitarist Scott Gorham is back where it all began, on a mission to breathe new life into their music.
We've been talking about this for years, actually taking the original recordings of the albums that we did, the earlier albums, and to go into the studio and put kind of a remix on these things. Just be cool to hear Phil's voice in a really nice produced atmosphere.
Scott's on his way to the home studio of Def Leppard lead singer Joe Elliott.
Joe, baby!
Good, man.
He'll be working with ex-Thin Lizzy drummer Brian Downey to bring these tracks back to life.
High low, looking right to left.
They're starting with the legendary Jailbreak, the 6th of 14 albums they released in their career.
From under my breath. When I count to 3, blast them.
Gosh, why didn't we use that?
Coming, I think it's best.
Seems like it was yesterday, really. That's a pretty distinctive voice, talking, singing, anything, you know. When you were around as much as Brian and I were, it just seems like it was like you should be walking through the door, you know. If that happened, I think I'd go right through the plate glass window.
Straight out.
Words I wrote and play and sing for you.
The seeds of Ireland's first commercially successful rock band was sown on the streets of a tough neighbourhood in 1960s Dublin. It was here where 16-year-old Philip Paris Lynott got his first gig, singing in a neighbourhood covers band. Brian Downey was an ex-pipe band drummer who lived just around the corner from the singer.
He was in a band called the Black Eagles, and I used to actually go and see him playing in Dublin. He was a great singer. He was a brilliant frontman. He had great presence on stage. I said to him one day, and I said, look, you know, the band is really great. They said, what do you do? And I said, I play drums. They said, come down next week and you can play support with us. So I was with them for about maybe 2.5 years. Black Eagles was a bit of a laugh, with Phil and the guys, but the band broke up. We kind of lost contact for a bit.
After short stints apart playing with other musicians, Phil and Brian got together once more to form a band called Orphanage. One of the first people to see them play was Eric Bell, a blues-loving guitarist from north of the border who'd once played with Van Morrison.
I went to this club one night with this keyboard player. The band came on to play, and it was a band called Orphanage, and Phil Lynott was the singer, and Brian Downey was the drummer. It just blew me away, And they took a break during the night. I started talking to them, and I said, yeah, I could fit my guitar playing into your song style. And Philip says, hey, Brian, do you fancy forming a group with Eric? And he said to Brian, I want to play the bass, and I also want to do some of my own songs. So I said, yeah, okay, let's give it a go.
Up to now, my youthful stage.
In 1969, the new band started gigging Phil's compositions of folk rock with a Celtic twist. All they needed now was a name.
Eric Bell thought of the name. There was a comic called the Beano, the Beano, and on a John Mayall album cover, Eric Clapton was reading the Beano, so Eric Bell was a big Eric Clapton fan at the time, so he went out, and when we were looking for a name of the band, he bought a copy of the Beano, and there was a female robot called Tin Lizzie, spelled Tinlizzie. And he said, we should call the band Thin Lizzy. I thought it was a dreadful name. I thought, it was like, what does this mean, And so we made it Thin Lizzy because Dubliners say tin anyway, so it was about as deep as that.
The new band started to look for gigs. But unlike Britain, where clubs, rock concerts and even music festivals were everywhere, the Irish scene was still years behind.
Strangers in the night, exchanging glances, wandering in the night.
Ireland was a very backward place at that point in time, especially in the country. The show bands ruled the roost. It was usually 8 people, a brass section, keyboards, guy at the front singing. They would do the top 20 that was in the charts at that particular time. And they would also do evergreen songs like Danny Boy. One of the first gigs we did, there was an Irish show band on before us, and there was about 600 people there, very country people. So the show band finished and we walked on, and they just laughed, basically, and started pointing up at us. Look at him, look at him. Seriously. They never seen nothing like it in their life. I thought it was like a UFO had landed outside.
Look what the wind just blew in.
Bill was always a very striking figure because he was tall and thin and basically good-looking guy, very unusual. He was the only black guy of his age group there were very few black people in Ireland at that stage, certainly around Dublin, a few students at Trinity, and that was it.
I think he always saw himself as being some sort of an artisan. He did hang out with poets, he did go to poetry sessions, and I basically think that he knew he was different, but he was going to make that difference work for him.
Look what the wind just blew in.
It didn't take the three-piece with the black singer long to make a name for itself on the Dublin club circuit. But what they needed more than anything was a record deal.
I was going to Ireland anyway with an in-house producer. We were going to look at a singer, actually.
called Ditch Cassidy. Ditch was very good, but it was a three-piece band behind him. And I must admit, I was watching more than Ditch Cassidy. Great drummer, fabulous guitar player. And Phil, a black Irishman, never seen before. He was so thin, you could have knitted with him, you know, he was lovely.
And here I'll go into new day.
The deal was they would have to come and work and live in England. There was no point in signing a band who were going to stay in Ireland. That was no good to us because any record sales, you know, wouldn't cover their boat fare.
Thin Lizzy landed in Britain in 1971 as glam rock bands like Slade were breaking into the charts, alongside established acts like David Bowie and The Who. They recorded 2 albums in quick succession, but neither made much impact. If they were going to have a hit, the three-piece from Dublin would need some Irish luck.
Thin Lizzy used to rehearse in this pub in King's Cross, I think it was, upstairs. And we used to rehearse here every week if we weren't playing. And sometimes it just wouldn't happen. On this particular day, we were having a hard time. So Philip, anyway, picked up a guitar and he started going down. You know, he's just messing about with these Irish songs. And about 20 minutes later, he started going, as I was going over the Cork and Kerry mountains. And Phil, Brannamee's sitting there going, you know. At that point, one of our managers came in, Ted Carroll.
I said, I think if you can go in the studio and record it just like you played it now, you've got a hit.
And we said, don't be stupid, you know. We left Ireland to get away from that type of music, and now you want us to record it. So me and Philip went out with 2 acoustic guitars. Bran got on the drums.
Germany, Finland, Holland, Spain, and we're actually going out to these places to play Whiskey in the Jar, but we weren't playing it. We were just miming it, you know, on TV shows. And you know, everybody was getting kind of, you know, fed up with this, you know, especially Eric Bell.
He was really just fed up with the whole, like, star trip, you know. Eric just wanted to play the guitar and get on with the music.
I started going on stage pretty out of my head and not bothering to practice anymore. I don't even think I tuned up the guitar anymore before I went on, because the band was no longer Thin Lizzy. We were playing on stage in Belfast, and this little voice within my head said, throw the playing on stage in Belfast, and this little voice within my head said, throw the guitar up in the air, kick the amps off the stage and walk off. This is it. And I just walked over to all my amps and I kicked them all off the stage. Underneath the stage was all these gymnasium mats. And I lay down on one. And that was it.
And I don't think the audience realised what was going on. I think they thought it was part of the act, you know. And Phil kept saying, Eric is coming back in a few minutes, you know, he's just going to have to get a few drinks for us. But he never actually came back on.
Phil and Brian decided to hire a rising star called Gary Moore to take Eric's place. But after just 3 months, he left too, which had a profound effect on Phil's view of the band's future size and shape.
He said, we're not going to just have one guitar player, we're going to have two, in case one guy decides to leave in the middle of a tour, you know. And so that's how that double twin guitar thing came about.
Auditions began for a pair of guitarists, bringing a huge number of hopefuls knocking at Liz's door.
So, are you coming in or what?
Now 54, Brian Robertson was just 17 when he heard Thin Lizzy was searching for 2 new guitarists.
I always had it in my head that I was going to join Lizzy anyway. When you're a kid, I mean, we used to wait for Saturday and save our money up so we could go and buy another album. Hence, I knew all the tracks when I went for the audition with Lizzy. And I was sitting there watching these other guys, and I was just thinking, they're shit. And I was quite relaxed, just sitting waiting for my turn, because as far as I was concerned in my head, I knew what was going to happen.
With one place filled, the new 3-piece had to wait another week before they found their second guitarist.
Harmony.
Now 59, Scott Gorham was a 23-year-old on the verge of outstaying his UK visa when he turned up for his audition.
I walked in and, you know, there was Robbo up on the stage and Brian Downey. They looked miserable, those two guys, absolutely miserable. You know, I brought over a Stratocaster with me, but I'd run out of money, so I had to sell it. But now I'm still left with my little Japanese Les Paul copy. So Phil says, just whip your guitar out and come on up on the stage. And I remember opening up the lid of this guitar and pulling it out, and both Robbo and Downey looked at this guitar and went, oh man, what is this? Oh geez. But Phil was really cool about it, you know. You still had the energy. He said, yeah, come on up, strap your guitar and let's go. And I'm, yeah, okay. Whatever I did, whatever I played on the day, well, it's obvious. I guess they liked what they heard.
In 1974, with Robbo and Scott on guitars, the New Look band got to work, vowing never to play any of the old material again. Within 6 months, Lizzy released Nightlife, their first album as a 4-piece. It was a significant step forward from their earlier albums, but they were still searching for a musical signature when they began recording their next album, Fighting.
I think Robbo was actually in the studio and there was one line that he was going to play and I was going to go in there and double it or something, but the engineer had put this however many millisecond kind of delay on that one line. So when he played it, you know, the delay came back and it was harmonizing itself. You know, we went, wait a minute, you know, that actually sounds kind of cool. So, you know, it's just kind of more of an accident, really, that we fell into the whole harmony guitar kind of thing, right? But, you know, after that, we kind of went for it.
Lizzy hit the club circuit, touring Britain non-stop and doing small American trips in support of larger acts. This was the mid-70s. Live rock music was everywhere. And with this new musical identity that lied to Phil's songwriting, the band started to build a following.
While one the gypsies warned of the danger. You can laugh and joke with your friends, but don't you talk to strangers.
It had been 3 years since Whiskey, and without another hit single they couldn't survive commercially. The record company issued an ultimatum.
The Jailbreak album, it was make or break time. The band is still heavily in debt, sleeping two in a bed in these really grotty little hotels. And we were told in no uncertain terms that this was it, guys. You don't come up with the goods on this one, boom, you're done.
Tonight there's gonna be a jailbreak somewhere in this town.
They were confident the title track could be a hit. But the song that would go on to become one of the greatest rock anthems ever almost didn't see the light of day.
I think it was like 15 songs we had come up with, and of which, 10 were only going to actually make it onto the album. The manager came down and he says, well, let me have a listen to all 15 songs. And he goes, this one here, actually I really like that. It's got kind of a, a hooky kind of guitar thing going for it. I love the, the vocal thing. How about you, and we hadn't had that one included on the list. That wasn't one of the 10. She says, well, how about you, for me, you record that one, and then take out that one there.
I'm in the toilet. The boys are back in town. I had the chord sequence, and I had about 2 verses for ages. And at one stage, it was called G.I. Joe is Back. It took me ages just to think of the boys, though. I was thinking of the kids, the lads, Somebody said that, the boys are here. And I went, that's it, the boys are back,
Friday night they'll be dressed to kill down at Dino's Bar and Grill.
For him, there was a lot of imagery in America. There used to be an American program, detective show called 77 Sunset Strip. And he was looking for this mythical place called 77 Sunset Strip, which didn't exist, right? The actual building that they filmed this detective agency at was Dino's, Dean Martin's place. It was just a restaurant. And and Phil just kind of liked the whole sort of Americanism. He put bar and grill on the end of it just because it had just a little bit more of an American thing going for it. So it became Dino's Bar and Grill.
Friday night they'll be dressed to kill down at Dino's Bar and Grill. The drink will flow and blood will...
The Boys Are Back in Town gave Lizzy the breakthrough they needed. Having now evolved into a top 10 band, they hit the road for another round of relentless touring at home and abroad.
Won't be long till summer comes.
I didn't really think of it at the time, but I mean, we were just sort of conditioned to work as much as you could. I mean, that was the whole idea of putting the band together, to get as successful as possible. We were just always on the road. At the time, I was convinced we were one of the hardest working bands around.
The problem was, they were partying as hard as they worked. The Lizzie Boys had always enjoyed a drink, but with success came bigger parties and much bigger bar bills.
Yeah, I think we probably were pretty bad. But in a nice way. We didn't kill anybody, let's put it that way.
When Thin Lizzy started, I had a bit of a world-boy image. I was tired of hearing rock and roll stars saying how sorry they were for themselves, you know, like how they disliked fame and how they were bothered. I jumped at it, you know, I was famous. I thought, great, the women are after me, you know. Like, people want to buy me free drink, you know, they want to treat me, they want to take me here, like, they want to take me there. Great. And, you know, I really went for it, hook, line and sinker.
But Phil's party was about to end, just as the band looked set to crack America with their best-selling album yet.
It was about a week of being out on the road in America. Phil kind of staggered into the dressing room and just laid down on the floor. I just kind of looked at him and smiled. He goes, man, I can't move. I can't get up. I think they actually put him in the hospital that night. Get up the next day, there's a knock at my door, and it's Phil in the mirrored shades. He goes, man, I got some bad news. What? What's up, man? He goes, I'm really ill. You know, they say I've got hepatitis. So that was it. Tour over. We're stopped in our tracks. I can't tell you how depressed everybody was.
But within months, Phil and the band were back in the studio recording their second album of 1976, while the management set up another American tour. Phil had been warned to quit boozing and partying for his health. But one band member was only too happy to take up where he left off.
Brian he took on this kind of role of Hellraiser. All I can say is he was young and he liked drinking his whiskey and living that role, you know what I mean? That was a mantle that was kind of put on him. And he grasped it, you know what I mean, and went with it.
Yeah, I did get into a lot of fights. It was, you know, drinking whiskey all the time, which doesn't agree with me. I mean, I always had a bottle of whiskey at the side of the stage. And I probably had about half a bottle before I went on stage, and then drank the whole bottle while I was playing.
But the hell-raising boy wonder was about to come a cropper at the worst possible time for the band.
That was in the Speakeasy Club with Frankie Miller. And somebody went to bottle his face, and I went, no, don't do that. And it went straight through. And that was the night before I was supposed to go to America on tour. I wasn't going to see my friend get bottled. And actually, I thought, well, he's not going to go through my hand. And he did. And hospital time.
I mean, what was your reaction when you first heard what happened?
What happened? Exasperation. I was thinking, fuck Robbo and fuck Frankie Miller. Why would you be getting into fights down the Speakeasy? You know what I mean? There was no way they were going to get home anyway till 5 or 6. I think people used to leave the Speakeasy at 4 in the morning. You know what I mean? Robbo probably had a flight at 10 the next morning.
They were saying I was pissed as a fart and all this, right? No, Frankie was. I was totally sober at the time, but I shouldn't have been out at that time. I should have been at home packing, getting ready to leave in the morning, you know, so. But I wasn't, so there we go.
Robbo wasn't invited to rejoin the band. So it did have an effect on the band in America, there's no doubt about it. Obviously the promoters in America thought that was crazy, you know, getting into a fight the night before a major American tour.
We were on such a great run at that point, mentally, physically, playing-wise, everything. I mean, we just knew that that was going to be the tour that was going to break us. And it's kind of hard to get all the stars all lined up again, you know, to get, you know, that kind of, you know, exact feeling again, you know. This one hurt, and it hurt real bad.
In 1977, with Robbo now out of the band, Gary Moore was invited back to take his place for a hastily arranged US tour supporting Queen. Lizzie had rarely played to such huge audiences, so being on the road with one of the world's biggest bands was a revelation.
We start to learn what it was like touring at this level. You know, seeing Freddie work the audience. He realised that if you have fans out there, and if you do ask them to clap, they will do it.
I've never known anyone enjoy being a rock star so much. Unless Philip got into a pair of leather trousers in the morning and walked out the door, or in the afternoon should I say, and walked out the door and there was a limousine, that's what life was, isn't it?
He got wrapped up in the suit that you should wear as a rock star. You know, it's almost like when you were sitting chatting to him, he's this quiet, really quietly spoken character. And then when he'd go on stage, he'd step into this suit and zip it up, and all of a sudden he was the rocker.
Now all they needed was a hit album to match their growing rock star status. And for 1977's bad reputation, they went to the man they knew could deliver it. Tony Visconti was already a legendary producer who'd helped turn David Bowie and T-Rex into huge stars. But if the Lizzie boys were intimidated by meeting such a big name, they certainly didn't show it.
I saw them from my first floor window and opened the door, let them in, and they were drunk. They were just drunk. It was about 3 p.m. in the afternoon. I invited them up to my front room. My then wife, Mary Hopkin, was about to offer them tea, and she saw the state that they were in. She said, "Forget the tea, forget about it." And she just disappeared up in the bedroom somewhere. They were looking for a new sound, and all you have to do is compare the production values of Bad Reputation to the previous one. You know, we were getting into a full-blown choir, synthesized sounds, and they wanted anything I could throw at them. They really wanted their guitars to sound different, especially the bass. We used these things like phasing and flanging on the bass. And then my wife, Mary Hopkin, came with our kids, and as Mary was right there, she was elected to come into the studio and sing this beautiful, beautiful choir arrangement on Dear Lord. And I'll never forget that. I mean, the band thought they were in heaven.
All of a sudden, Brian Downey's drums were sounding great. I was getting good guitar sounds. Phil was, you know, singing and playing great bass. You know, he was just, it was all coming together for us.
By now, Gary Moore had left for a second time, leaving Scott to record all the guitar parts himself. Feeling some of the old magic was missing, he convinced Phil to invite Robbo back in. But the angry young Scotsman was still licking his wounds and wasn't going to make life easy for anyone.
When it was time for Brian's solos, he'd be sitting either in the studio apart from us, and he'd have a bottle of Courvoisier in his hand, be drinking. And then Phil said, "Are you going to do your solo now, Brian?" Or I would say, "It's time for the solo." And he'd say, "Yep," something like that, "Okay," you know. And couldn't talk to him, you know, so he'd march out to the studio, pick up his guitar, and just shred, like, you know, played beautifully. And we go, "Wow," you know, and we'd clap, we'd press the talk back button and clap and all that, and he wouldn't even look up and acknowledge us. I would say, "Come and have a listen to it." And he would kind of either walk through the control room to the next room where he was hanging out, or he wouldn't come in the control room at all. And I'd go find him and I'd say, "Brian, don't you want to hear this?" He goes, "No."
Maybe I was feeling a little bit angry So I'm being a bit stroppy again, you know, right? I'm not joining about. I mean, I sat in the hotel and I wouldn't go out with any of them. You know, I'd finish recording and I'd go back to my room.
What, because you felt stabbed in the back, or?
No, it's because I was just being a little git, basically.
Despite Robbo's behaviour, Bad Reputation became Lizzy's highest charting album to date, going gold in just 4 weeks. A leap forward in songwriting and production, it delivered fan-pleasing rock songs, alongside surprises like the pop classic Dancing in the Moonlight.
It was just unbelievable. Great man for Eric's, you know. Chocolate stains on my pants. We used to go to these flea pits, we used to call them, the Star Cinema in Crumlin. You'd sit down on these seats and, you know, you come out of there destroyed with chewing gum on your trousers and all sorts of stuff. And I think that's where that line came from, you know.
It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm on the streets again. I disobeyed another one now. I should have been in by 10. Now I won't get out until Sunday. I'll have to say, hey, I stayed with friends.
It was fairly lightweight. It was a real pop song. If someone who couldn't sing as good as Phil sang that, if someone who was just twee sang Dancing in the Moonlight, it probably would have come off very saccharine or very silly, you know.
The last bus has gone.
At a time when Britain was in the grip of punk, the young rockers were more popular than ever. With Robbo now back in the band full-time, Lizzy was selling out huge concert halls and headlining festivals with crowds of 40,000 people.
They were brilliant live. I mean, he really knew how to work a stage and get an audience with a scruff of the neck.
At their best, then Lizzy were the best live band in the world. Nobody could touch them. They knew that Phil was a great frontman. Scott knew he looked good. Phil knew that Scott looked good. Robbo says so arrogant that he thought everybody looked good. And Downey, who's a complete muso, Downey knows everything.
The problem was that they'd never been able to capture the energy of their live performances on an album.
The live album genre really wasn't that big, you know, at the time. You know, Peter Frampton, yeah, I mean, I think he was the first that I'd known about that actually had a huge successful live album. And quite honestly, we thought we could do a better one.
For Live and Dangerous, they went back to Tony Visconti for the second time in a year. But by doing so, they would unwittingly create one of rock's great controversies.
I'm going to go down on record as saying it was not my choice to do this. Phil said, like on the first song, he goes, I made a mistake on the bass. I have to fix it. I was singing at the same time. I said, okay, Phil. We listened to it. There's the mistake. It's certainly there. So Phil replays that entire track, and we don't need the live bass anymore. Then when Scott and Brian Robertson came to studio to hear it, they said, that's not fair. If you let Phil fix his parts, we made a couple of mistakes. So to remedy this, I had Scott and Brian replay their live parts. I used some of the original sound, but mostly the overdub parts. So the blend was, say, 30% live guitar and 70% in the balance, you know, and it sounded fantastic. Within the first couple of tracks, we established a sound that now we had to follow through with the rest of the album.
these rumours going around that it's not a live album. It's not true. I mean, there's only, as far as I remember, I mean, all the drum tracks, I mean, from start to finish, the drums are live on that album. There's not one extra overdub on the drums. There's nothing. Everything is just completely live. And as far as I know, there's a couple of overdubs on guitar, but nothing major. It's only little parts here and there.
I didn't touch any of my guitars on the whole album. The only thing I overdubbed was a couple of backing vocals. Well, I don't know where Tony Visconti got 75% from, but and certain people have said that it was overdubbed and and it wasn't. So, fuck them.
There is a big dispute about what came from where. But who gives a shit? It sounds great, you know, and Visconti is the man who pulled that together.
I have the distinction of Bono from U2 coming to me when I work with him later. He's saying, that was the most fantastic live album I've ever heard. It was a primer for us. That was our textbook, U2. We wouldn't be U2 unless we heard Live and Dangerous.
Still consistently voted one of the best live albums ever, Live and Dangerous catapulted the band into the big league. Thin Lizzy was now a massive rock machine, but despite the success, once again, all was not well between Robbo and the rest of the band.
It was just the way that we were at the time. I was sort of in a certain frame of mind, and Phil was in another frame of mind. Scott was in another frame of mind, so I kind of wanted to move on a bit, you know. So, and I guess, you know, me and Phil were like that, so it wasn't working that well at the time.
I kept telling Brian to shut the fuck up, man. Just do the gig, man. You don't need to do this, you know. And then it just got to a point that we just couldn't defend it any longer, and so unfortunately he had to go.
Even with Robbo gone, this time for good, things were still looking bright for Lizzy. By 1979, Philip was heading for a showbiz marriage to Leslie Crowther's daughter, Caroline. Gary Moore was back in the band to record Black Rose. This would become the highest charting studio album of their career.
We chose Paris to make this album, and we picked EMI Studios. EMI Studios was used by the Rolling Stones. By this time, Phil had grown as a songwriter. Great song. Oh, he always was a great songwriter, but now he was fine-tuning. The title track is a beautiful piece. I would call it Celtic music by a rock band.
Phil finally got his wish to record an album with Gary Moore. And I think that was one of the things he really wanted to do, you know, was before I leave this earth, I will record an album with Gary Moore, you know, and that was basically Black Rose.
But the band Gary joined in the studio was very different from the one he'd left just a year before.
Black Rose was the beginning of the end. Things were going really, really well, but there was a certain point in the album where Phil thought he could relax a little bit, and he was drinking a lot. He would chop out copious lines of cocaine. There were 3 days where Phil was stuck in his hotel room, in his bed. He couldn't leave his bed. He was so sick. Obviously, this wasn't a flu or a head cold. This was something serious. I knew then, after that, I couldn't work with him anymore. It was too hurtful for me. I mean, I would just feel that I can't watch this guy kill himself. He was killing himself.
I've got to give it up. I've got to give it up.
There were drug dealers all over the place. Tony Visconti subsequently told me that if you listen to the Black Rose album, you'll hear that Phil's voice is very, like he has a head cold because he was taking so much coke at the time.
I've got to give it up.
Paris was probably the wrong city for Thin Lizzy to go and hang out in. I mean, we literally used to get the drug dealers pounding on the door trying to get in, and we let them in. Before then, it was all kind of recreational. Now all of a sudden it starts to get serious. You know, the smack starts to come in, and whoa, yeah, we haven't tried this yet. Oh, let's try a little bit of this.
Halfway through a US tour to promote the album, Gary Moore packed his bags and left Thin Lizzy for the third and final time. The right-hand side of the stage needed filling once more. This time, Lizzy chose a guitarist no one could have anticipated. Midge Ure had left Visage and was just about to join Ultravox when Phil the Rocker came calling.
I was in the studio and I got a phone call from Philip saying, you know, I'm in Arkansas on the middle of a tour, you know, with Lizzy, and we're opening up for Journey and, you know, special guests, and it's huge stadiums and whatever. And Gary Moore's not in the band anymore. Can you come out and finish the tour? Now, why he asked me to come out and do it, I'll never know, because I'm not a twiddly-diddly whiz-kid guitarist like Lizzy has. You know, I'm fairly standard. In fact, I could probably, I think I hail myself as the worst guitarist Lizzy ever had. But he invited me out because I think he saw there was an association with, maybe I was cool, or the band I was in was cool, or the music that I was playing was cool. And Phil wanted to integrate this into Lizzy. His management company sent over a bunch of cassettes and said, learn these and we'll fly out tomorrow. And I thought, well, I'd never been to America, I'd never been anywhere. And I thought, great. So I got home from the studio that night, packing my bags. I thought, well, I've got the set list and I've got the cassettes, and I'll take my big ghetto blaster, because it was before Walkmans, and I'll learn the songs on the plane. And of course they sent me out in Concorde, and halfway through the second song, learning it on the plane, we kind of landed. So I turned up completely unprepared. I hadn't learned any of the set. So the first night in New Orleans, when I finally got there, I spent the evening with Scott in a hotel room, the two of us with two guitars, desperately trying to learn all these harmony parts. And next night I was on stage for, 45 minutes.
I am just a cowboy, lonesome on the trail.
The most complicated part was every song had a harmony guitar part in it. And trying to remember which harmony guitar part went in which song it was almost like, those jigsaws you get of the sea or the sky, and you can put any bits in any bit of the jigsaw. It was a bit like that. You could put any harmony guitar part in any Thin Lizzy song, and it kind of, in your head, sounded all right until you heard what Scott was playing. You realised you were playing the wrong one. It really was Spinal Tap. It was hotel suites and limos to and from the airport, and hanging about the airport for hours, and then getting on a flight that took 20 minutes to get to the next city, and then you'd get picked up by another limo and then back into another hotel. By the time it took you to do all of that, you could have driven between the cities. I was kind of bored after a week. I think, you've got to hang about an airport again, because it was perceived that's what a big band did. Oh, crap. The worst guitarist Lizzy ever had.
When Midge Ure left at the end of the tour, Lizzy's revolving door never stopped turning. 3 guitarists came and went in 4 years. Ex-Pink Floyd player Snowy White, and John Sykes from the Tigers of Pantang were just two to grace the Lizzie lineup, who by now were starting to sound more like a full-blown heavy metal band.
Every few months you might have a different guitar player playing on stage with you, but that's what happened. But yeah, you know, it was a bit strange, okay? So many guitar players coming through the ranks. But yeah, we just, you know, that's the way it was. I mean, guys leave and other people join.
By the early 80s, Thin Lizzy was still releasing album after album and touring as hard as ever, all the while living life to the max, especially Phil and Scott, now in the grip of serious drug habits.
The frightening thing about heroin is that it is very enjoyable to take. It cuts off reality. If you've got a lot of problems and you want to just, so it's very easy to, you know, I mean, it's so easy, it'd be so easy for me to just jump up on television and say, hey, this is the pits, don't do it. The thing that's never put across on television very well is how enjoyable it can be. Now, I never got to the stage where I became so addicted that my body craved, you know, like physically for it, but mentally, that battle will continue for the rest of my life.
Well, I think it did destroy the band. There's no doubt about it. You know, it destroyed the band completely. I mean, when heroin gets in, that affects your ability to play rather than anything else. I mean, I personally, physically, after I tried it, couldn't play. I learned after about 4 or 5 weeks of being on it that this was not for me. I just stopped. I've never taken it since, you know.
By 1983, it was becoming increasingly clear that the rock and roll lifestyle they had pursued and that some band members had embraced had begun to catch up with them. By the end of that year, Scott finally got out and hasn't looked back since.
Golf kind of saved my life. You know, when you take drugs as heavily as we did and then you stop, there's a massive hole in your life, and you're always trying to fill that hole, right? And it's amazing how just trying to hit that stinking little white ball with this tiny little club, it's all-encompassing. That's all you want to concentrate on doing. I think kind of crunch time for me came, we were playing some massive festival, and I remember not wanting to go up on the stage. I was absolutely out of my box. And, you know, I started to think about that. My whole life, you work yourself into these positions to get into this position where you've always wanted to be in, and now you don't want to do it because you're not stoned enough, you know? And I thought, this just ain't right. I remember Phil turning over and looking at me, and he just had this horribly depressed look on his face. And, you know, he was sweating anyway, but it actually looked like, you know, tears were coming down because the pain was so bad. And I thought, oh man, you know, this is wrong, and we gotta fix this.
The solution was a farewell tour seen by over 100,000 fans. Then the journey that had started in Dublin 14 years before just came to an end.
At the last gig, we just literally at the airport just said, see you guys, you know, bye. Got on the plane and different planes, and that was it. Just went our separate ways, and, you know, that was it. And there's no talk of, you know, we'll see in 6 months and reconsider. There's nothing like that. So that was the end of that.
The pop singer Phil Lynott died in hospital in Salisbury this afternoon. The 35-year-old Irish singer had been taken to hospital from a clinic specialising in drug and alcohol addiction. Doctors say he died of pneumonia and heart failure.
I think I'm gonna fall to pieces if I don't find something else to do. The sadness, it never ceases. Oh, I'm still in love with you.
I do know that, that band was his whole life. He invested a lot of his life into that band, as we all did. But for Phil, it was something way deeper. I mean, he just loved Thin Lizzy. I mean, just loved that band.
Is this the end? I'm still in love with you.
I just wish Philip was alive. I just wish he was alive, because they would have been kings, It's not just me imagining they were superb. They were. Look at the guitar players he used. They were the equivalent of an Irish Yardbirds or John Mayall Blues Break. It was like an academy of great musicians. I mean, you only play with great people if you're great.
Lizzy built a bridge from Ireland over to the UK and then on to the rest of the world. And that bridge has been used by many, many, many Irish bands. I think there's no doubt that U2 owe a huge debt of gratitude. They paved the way. When you go around Dublin, you don't see many statues of rock stars.
Is this the end?
For some reason, for some magical reason, their music is completely timeless. You see people in blogs saying favourite bands, and they'll list bands from this year, and then somewhere in there among them will be Thin Lizzy. They're totally timeless.
Still in love with you.
I think if the original lineup of Scott and Brian had stayed together and kept at it, I think they would eventually have become, one of the biggest bands in the world,
Did you see a day when the three of you would play again together?
No.
Well, we're trying. I'll go that far. We're trying right now. You'll see a Thin Lizzy tour, absolutely. I mean, we're trying to get as many original guys back up there as possible, and get it back to, the sound, the Thin Lizzy sound.
One last question. Harking back to the fact Lizzy had been in existence for 13 years, and all those albums, tracks and songs that you've recorded, would there be any one song or one album that, supposing 20 years' time, you could look back and say, yes, I created that?
To be a stack of them. Duke Ellington had a great answer to that question. He used to say, my favourite song is the next one. And hopefully that'll be my answer in 20 years' time,
Right. Thanks a lot, Phil.